Hey, everybody, this is Alex Merced, and you're listening to my data podcast. And what I want to do is talk to you about something I've been hearing. Well, I hear every once in a while, in the discussions around the lake house, especially over this last year. This is the idea that will Apache Iceberg and Delta Lake merge? Okay. And basically, the premise idea here is that, oh, they're going to become one thing, so you don't need to care anymore about your choice. You can just, you know, go use Iceberg or we just go use Delta Lake, and you don't need to think about it any further because soon enough they'll be the same thing. One, no, and let me explain sort of the whys and the things to kind of consider. Now, this kind of you started really hearing this after mid last year when Databricks bought Tabular. So Tabular was a company that had a commercial Iceberg catalog offering. The company was founded by the initial creators of Iceberg, and they were bought out by Databricks, who are the creators of Delta Lake, thus starting to create this kind of discussion. Do I need to still care about this? And to an extent, yes, you do. Now, I do think a lot of the movement to more cooperation has been a good thing in the sense that now you're starting to see the communities work together on not necessarily unifying the formats, but unifying the building blocks, which is particularly Parquet. So we've seen this particularly in the push for Parquet to have the variant data type and geospatial data types and things like this, because basically whatever data types Parquet supports, Delta and Iceberg can support, because those tables are generally made up of Parquet files. And I think this is a good thing. So in the sense that there is more collaboration between these communities to help build better primitives, I think that's a good thing. Now, I do find some of the sort of the FUD or the fear, uncertainty, doubt about the idea of these two projects merging to be a little disingenuous in the sense that what it does, it creates this false sense of security that they're just the same thing. They're not, and they're because let's just think about sort of the practicalities. Let's say like for the two projects to merge, let's say one code base decided to kind of merge certain parts of it and then say, hey, there's only one project going forward. There's two ways this could happen. One, Apache Iceberg merges into Delta Lake, which just means like, hey, now it's controlled by Databricks. That's not going to happen. Most of the industry probably would then just make a fork of Iceberg that is just separately managed, and you'd still be in the same place. Just because, again, everybody doesn't want to have their business, the format that they build their business upon, being controlled sort of by one player. But if you do it the other way around, you say Delta Lake merges into Iceberg, well, this would mean that Databricks would no longer have the same sort of agility they have to add features to the format they do with Delta Lake. Since Delta Lake, while there is plenty of contributors from other companies and other places, when you take a look at a lot of these the other language APIs, oftentimes the way these formats work is that the features are really decided in the Java API. Okay, so generally features are implemented in Java first, and then all the other, that's where what's referred to as the reference implementation happens, and then people will then go make the Python API, the Rust API, the Go API for that, but they're essentially re-implementing the features that were already kind of instituted in Java. So whoever controls sort of the Java API controls the format in a sense, and in Iceberg is just sort of one big. Well, now they're separate repos, so it's no longer one big repo, but it was. But again, that's the pattern you see. Like it's basically you're re-implementing what you see in the Java API because the Java API was first and is always furthest along. And in Delta Lake, you have different repos for the different APIs, but the core repo, the Delta core repo, is essentially the Java Scala API, and that is primarily controlled by Databricks. Which means generally like what features get added in there. And because they primarily control it with one entity, they can make a change really quick. And now as a business, that's a useful thing for them because then they can move things quickly when they feel like there's something worth moving quickly towards. They don't have to build the consensus necessarily with other vendors. Now, of course, they're going to want to build consensus with their customers and make sure that their customers are bought into changes, but that's different than buying into sort of the community of service providers so that we were all working on sort of exact standards. And again, that's not a bad or a good thing. It's just I'm just trying to like understand sort of like the differences and sort of the incentives and the structure of these things. So that way, if they were to become one code base, there's just not a way I can see that can get reconciled. Now, what's probably more likely being hinted at is just the incorporation of Tabular's catalog features into Unity Catalog. Which means that maybe eventually, not yet, right now still, Unity Catalog is primarily a Delta Lake catalog. To its credit, it does have Uniform, which allows you to query in a read-only fashion those tables as Iceberg tables, okay, which is to me a great thing because it allows you to take advantage of really cool Iceberg tools, like with Dremio, where you can use feature code reflections to accelerate data, so you can take advantage of those things. So that's awesome. But it's not the same thing as if you're someone who is intentionally trying to architect a Iceberg Lakehouse where you're reading and writing into Iceberg data, then Unity Catalog currently is not an option. Now, if they do incorporate eventually the tabular functionality into Unity Catalog, then it may become both, and then in that case, it's not so much that the two formats have merged. You just have one catalog that can serve both formats. And I do think over time, most catalogs will probably become multi-format catalogs. And actually, after this episode, I'm going to be doing a series for like the next 4 episodes about catalogs and understanding the catalog space better. Because, there's a difference between, hey, these two formats are now one format versus, hey, I am using a tool that makes it easy for me to use both formats when needed. Okay, the catalog is essentially a different tool, a different sort of layer of the stack. So again, is there anything wrong with either format? No. I mean, again, it just depends on sort of what your workflows are. As I've always said, generally, if you're doing probably most of your stuff in Databricks, using Delta Lake is going to make a lot of sense because it's very integrated into everything in Databricks, top to bottom. If you're not all in on Databricks, then you're going to generally want a format that's probably going to have just a little bit broader, a broader ecosystem, and that's where like Iceberg makes a lot of sense. But again, in which bucket you're in, it just depends on sort of your particular workflows and your particular goals and whatnot. And in the future, again, probably having to worry about which format you're using for a particular workload will become less of something to think about. But I still don't think there's going to be a merging of the formats. I do imagine Iceberg and Delta Lake are here to stay. I do think both of them have enough adoption at this point that they've locked in their incumbency for sort of like generations of data architecture to come. There are other formats that like Hoodie and Paimon that are in there and carving their space, and they might get to that point of incumbency as well. But right now, what matters at the end of the day is you figure out sort of like one, move to a lakehouse. Now again, you don't want to have to migrate all your data multiple times, so kind of thinking about what table format you want is sort of the key decision. You can always change catalogs, you can change engines, most part pretty easily. And again, which format should really be based on your particular types of workloads, particular tools you want to use. Like anything else, you should start with your requirements first. Don't go in there, don't go say, hey, I'm going to go research Iceberg and Delta Lake and make a decision, because you're always going to find someone who's going to say, hey, well, this format's better in this space, but that particular pro may not be relevant to you. So if you don't go in there thinking what are your needs first, it's going to be a lot harder for you to make a decision and you get stuck in analysis paralysis. What really matters is that you know what you need. You sit there and you establish your requirements first, and then you go in there and say, okay, hey, which ones meet my requirements better? Okay, and then move forward and then say, hey, for the requirements that they don't meet, what are sort of my alternatives to work around those gaps, and see which one kind of gives you the most complete picture for your particular needs. Hearing people, even like myself, talk about how awesome some feature you're not going to use isn't going to necessarily be as helpful if you don't know what you need first. So bottom line is like you want to make sure you do that sort of. If you're building a lake house now, you want to make sure you kind of do that audit where you're asking people sort of like, hey, what are your expectations? What are your needs? Whatnot. And again, you're never going to get it perfect because oftentimes, even if you ask people and you think about it, you may not necessarily know what you need, but you sometimes, if you make a precursor sort of effort at building sort of a set of requirements, and at least it gives you sort of an anchor in your decision-making process. And of course, in the educational process, you'll become aware of other things that may become requirements, but you'll at least have a place, sort of a grounding of sorts. So yeah, so that's what I really want to say about this episode. In this episode, again, are Delta Lake and Iceberg going to merge? No. Will they adopt become closer and look more like each other over time? Yeah, I think so. If one has a good idea, I would expect that the other one will adopt it, and you've seen that in both ways, where both formats sitting right now. Iceberg has like partition evolution, and I think recently Delta has made changes that kind of allow it to have some ability to have partition flexibility. I still have to kind of read into it. But I don't think it necessarily has full blown partition evolution like Iceberg. But then Delta Lake introduces deletion vectors, and while Iceberg has delete files, deletion vectors might prove to be a more compact, more efficient way to store these kind of deltas regarding your deleted files. And there's talk about adopting that in Iceberg. So again, when they have good ideas and they adopt each other's good ideas, they're going to become closer to each other, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing when you want to see open source projects learn from each other and improve from each other. But it's not the same thing as them merging. It's the difference between saying, hey, these two bodies, these two groups of people and developers who are working on these two things are going to become one team of developers working on one thing that has all sorts of governance, political implications, and all sorts of different stuff that are not they matter. They're salient points. So yeah, that's all I really want to say. I'll see you all next week. So I'm going to be putting out an episode each Friday for the next several weeks, focusing on catalogs and stuff. So make sure you subscribe. And again, if you're watching this on iTunes or Spotify, do leave a review or a rating or whatnot, so that way more people get recommended the podcast. And I'll see you all later on. Have a great day.